You clearly don't belong here, and you certainly don't belong in my seat." Those were the words that ended a woman's career before the plane even pushed back from the gate. She thought she was talking to just another passenger, someone she could easily intimidate and dismiss. She was wrong. Dead wrong. She wasn't just trying to steal a seat from some random traveler. She was going head-to-head with the man who owned the entire airline. And what happened next didn't just ground the flight. It brought down an empire of entitlement that had been decades in the making. The humid August air outside JFK's Terminal 5 pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows like a living thing, but inside the Delta Sky Club, the atmosphere was crisp and controlled, carrying the faint aroma of freshly ground espresso and the subtle leather scent of expensive luggage. Damon Hayes adjusted the collar of his navy blazer, the fabric slightly worn at the edges, but perfectly tailored to his 6-foot frame. At 44, he had learned that the most powerful people were often the least obvious ones, and today, like most days, he preferred it that way. As the CEO of Apex Airways, a boutique airline group that had quietly acquired controlling stakes in 6 luxury carriers across 3 continents, Damon could have demanded a private jet for the trip to Geneva. His board of directors certainly expected him to travel that way, especially with tomorrow's merger meeting that could reshape the European aviation market. But Damon had a different philosophy about leadership, one his father had drilled into him during those long afternoons in the aircraft maintenance hangar, where he'd learned that the real story of any machine was told by the people who worked on it every day, not the ones who merely signed the checks. Understanding comes from the ground up. His father used to say, wiping grease from his hands with a red shop rag. And if you want to know if an airplane really works, you don't ask the pilot. You ask the mechanic who crawls inside the engine. That wisdom had guided Damon through 15 years of building his company from a single regional route into a global network. And it was why he made it a point to fly commercial whenever possible, usually on his own airlines, without announcing his presence to anyone except the absolute minimum security personnel required by company protocol. Today's flight was Apex Airways Flight 847, a direct route to Geneva that his subsidiary Pinnacle Air had been operating for just 6 months. Damon wanted to experience the service quality firsthand, to sit in the same seats his paying customers occupied, to observe the crew interactions and passenger experience without the artificial polish that inevitably appeared whenever executives were expected. His boarding pass showed seat 2A, the bulkhead row, in first class, a spot he'd specifically requested not for the extra legroom, but because it offered the clearest view of how the cabin crew managed their service flow during the critical boarding period. The worn leather messenger bag at his feet told its own story. It had been his father's a Christmas gift from Damon's mother, back when his dad was still dreaming of someday flying in an airplane instead of just fixing them. Marcus Hayes had never lived to see his son's success, but Damon carried that bag on every business trip, a reminder that no matter how high he flew, he was still the son of a man who understood that respect had to be earned one honest day's work at a time. Mr. Hayes came a soft voice from behind the reception counter. Sarah, the lounge attendant, was a young woman with bright eyes and the kind of genuine smile that couldn't be trained into someone. Either you cared about people or you didn't. She'd recognized him from his Forbes cover photo 3 months earlier, but she'd also learned to respect his standing request for discretion. "We're ready for pre-boarding if you'd like. I can escort you through the priority access tunnel so you can board privately." Damon shook his head, slipping his tablet into the messenger bag and standing with the easy grace of someone who'd played college basketball before business school, redirected his trajectory. "Thank you, Sarah, but I'll walk with everyone else. It keeps me grounded." The small joke was intentional. In an industry where altitude was everything, he'd found that the best leaders were the ones who never forgot what solid ground felt like under their feet. The walk to Gate C-18 took him through the heart of the terminal's controlled chaos, past families juggling strollers and coffee cups, business travelers stabbing urgently at their phones, and tourists clutching boarding passes like winning lottery tickets. The mix of languages and energy reminded him why he'd fallen in love with aviation in the first place. There was something almost magical about the way airports brought together people from completely different worlds, all temporarily united by the shared faith that a machine weighing several hundred tons could somehow lift them safely above the clouds and deliver them to wherever their dreams were waiting. Gate C-18 was buzzing with the particular energy that accompanied international departures, a mixture of anticipation and barely controlled anxiety as passengers checked and rechecked their documents, wondering if they'd packed everything they needed for journeys that would take them thousands of miles from home. The boarding area was a cross-section of modern travel-exhausted parents trying to corral energetic children, nervous. First-time international travelers, clutching guidebooks and seasoned business travelers who moved through the process with the efficient detachment of people who spent more time in airports than in their own living rooms. Near the front of the priority boarding queue, however, a different kind of energy was building. The sharp, aggressive tension that comes when someone who's used to getting their way encounters an obstacle they can't simply demand out of existence. Victoria Ashworth stood at the gate agent's counter with the rigid posture of someone who'd never learned that the world wasn't actually designed to revolve around her personal convenience. At 38, she was the kind of woman who'd weaponized her appearance into a form of social intimidation, her platinum blonde hair styled into a severe bob that framed a face that might have been beautiful if it weren't so consistently arranged into expressions of dissatisfaction. Her cream-colored Armani suit looked like it cost more than most people's monthly rent, and the diamond tennis bracelet on her wrist caught the terminal lighting in a way that seemed almost calculated to remind everyone around her that she occupied a different economic stratosphere than the common travelers surrounding her. As the VP of marketing for Lux Essence, a high-end skincare company that catered to women who considered a $300 moisturizer a reasonable purchase, Victoria had spent the last decade convincing herself that her professional success was evidence of her inherent superiority rather than the result of family connections and market timing. "I'm going to say this one more time, Kevin," she announced to the gate agent, her voice carrying the kind of sharp authority that people use when they've never had to consider the possibility that their demands might be unreasonable. The gate agent, a tired-looking man in his 50s, whose name tag identified him as Kevin Martinez, was typing furiously on his computer while maintaining the professional smile that airline employees wear like armor against the daily assault of passenger entitlement. "My assistant specifically reserved seat 2A when we booked this flight 6 weeks ago. I have a presentation to rehearse. I need the privacy of the bulkhead row, and I absolutely cannot be cramped into some middle row where I'll be disturbed by other passengers." Kevin looked up from his screen, his expression patient but strained in the way of someone who'd been having this exact conversation for the past 15 minutes. "Mrs. Ashworth, I understand your frustration, but according to our system, seat 2A has been occupied since the original booking was made 4 months ago. Your current assignment is 6B, which is still in first class and offers the same amenities. The seat reclines to a full bed, you'll have priority meal service, and there's plenty of space to work on your presentation." Victoria's jaw tightened and she leaned forward slightly, invading Kevin's personal space in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate. "I don't think you understand who I am, Kevin. I am a Diamond Medallion member with this airline. My family has been flying with you people for over 20 years, and when I specifically request a particular seat, I expect that request to be honored. Now, I don't care if you have to offer whoever is in 2A an upgrade to business class on their next flight. Move them and put me where I belong." The casual dismissal in her voice when she said you people made several passengers in the nearby seating area look up from their phones and magazines, sensing the underlying tension that was building around the gate desk. Kevin's professional smile flickered for just a moment, but his training kicked in, and he maintained his composure while pulling up additional screens on his computer. "Ma'am, I'm not able to move passengers who are already checked in and confirmed, especially not for seating that was legitimately assigned months in advance. But I'd be happy to check if there are any other first-class options available, or if there's been a last-minute upgrade that might work better for you. Victoria straightened to her full height and crossed her arms, a gesture that made her diamond bracelet catch the light again in what seemed like a deliberate reminder of her economic status. "No, Kevin, what you're going to do is walk onto that airplane. Explain to whoever is squatting in my seat that there's been a mistake and escort them back to whatever section they actually paid for. I have meetings in Geneva that could affect hundreds of jobs, and I'm not going to arrive exhausted because you can't manage a simple seating chart." The boarding announcement crackled over the gate area speakers, calling for passengers needing special assistance and families with young children, and Kevin glanced anxiously at the growing line of passengers waiting to begin the boarding process. Ms. Ashworth: "I really need to start boarding the flight, but I promise you I'll continue working on your seating situation once we get through the initial groups. Sometimes passengers volunteer to switch seats once they're on board, and don't you dare start boarding until this is resolved." Victoria snapped, her voice rising enough that conversations throughout the seating area began to quiet as people turned to watch the unfolding drama. "I am not going to be humiliated by having to negotiate with some random passenger because you can't do your job properly." Damon Hayes had been observing the escalating confrontation from his position about 20 feet away, his experienced eye recognizing the particular type of conflict that occurs when someone who's spent their entire life having doors opened for them suddenly encounters a door that won't budge. He'd seen this exact dynamic play out countless times in his own business dealings. People who confused their economic circumstances with their moral worth, who genuinely believed that their ability to purchase premium services meant that the normal rules of courtesy and respect simply didn't apply to them. As his boarding group was called, Damon gathered his belongings and moved toward the gate, choosing to board promptly rather than wait for the confrontation to resolve itself. Experience had taught him that people like Victoria Ashworth rarely de-escalated situations on their own. They usually just got louder and more demanding until someone either gave them what they wanted or forced them to face consequences they'd never had to consider before. The jet bridge was filled with the usual mixture of excited energy and travel anxiety as passengers made their way toward the aircraft, and Damon found himself walking behind a family with young children who were chattering excitedly about their first trip to Europe. The parents looked exhausted, but happy, the kind of working-class family who'd probably saved for months to afford this vacation. And Damon felt a familiar surge of satisfaction, knowing that his airline service would give them memories they'd treasure for the rest of their lives. When he stepped through the aircraft doorway, the cabin enveloped him in the soft blue LED lighting that Pinnacle Air had specifically designed to create a sense of calm and luxury without being ostentatious. The air carried the clean scent of recently detailed leather and the subtle electronic hum of modern aircraft systems, and the flight attendant stationed near the entrance greeted him with the kind of warm, genuine smile that his customer service training emphasized, but couldn't really manufacture in people who didn't naturally care about others. "Welcome aboard, sir," said Maria Santos, a veteran flight attendant whose name tag indicated 15 years of service and whose demeanor suggested someone who genuinely enjoyed helping people navigate the complexities of air travel. "You're in seat 2A, right here on your left. Can I help you with your bag?" "Thank you, Maria, but I've got it," Damon replied, noting that she'd managed to make the interaction feel personal and welcoming without being overly familiar. This was exactly the kind of service culture he'd been working to build across his entire fleet. Professional but warm, efficient but never rushed. He settled into seat 2A, appreciating the way the seat's ergonomic design seemed to cradle his frame perfectly, and began arranging his belongings in the storage areas around him. The first-class cabin was filling steadily with the usual mixture of business travelers and leisure passengers who'd either earned upgrades through frequent flyer status or decided to splurge for special occasions. Across the aisle in 1B, an elderly businessman was already absorbed in a thick financial newspaper, occasionally making notes in the margins with a gold pen. Behind Damon, in row 3, a young couple was excitedly taking photos and selfies, clearly marking their first experience in premium seating. The atmosphere was relaxed and positive, the kind of environment where passengers could actually enjoy the journey instead of just enduring it. Damon pulled out his noise-canceling headphones and a paperback copy of a biography he'd been trying to finish for weeks, settling into the comfortable rhythm of pre-flight preparation. Through the small window beside his seat, he could see the ground crew efficiently loading luggage and conducting their final safety checks, a carefully choreographed ballet of professional aviation that most passengers never noticed, but that represented thousands of hours of training and experience working together to make flight possible. That peaceful moment was shattered by the sharp, staccato clicking of high heels on the cabin floor, a sound that seemed to cut through the ambient noise like fingernails on a chalkboard. Damon looked up from his book to see Victoria Ashworth sweeping into the first-class cabin with the kind of dramatic energy that suggested she viewed every entrance as a performance designed to announce her importance to whatever audience happened to be available. She stopped abruptly when she saw him seated in two. Her eyes taking in his appearance with a calculating assessment that was both insulting and revealing. Damon could practically see the mental calculations happening behind her eyes. She saw a black man in a blazer that looked a few years old reading a paperback book instead of working on a laptop with a worn messenger bag instead of expensive luggage. In Victoria's worldview, this picture didn't compute with someone who belonged in the premium seat she'd convinced herself she deserved. The few seconds of silence that followed felt charged with potential energy like the moment before a thunderstorm, when the air itself seems to be holding its breath. Other passengers in the first-class cabin were beginning to sense that something was about to happen, conversations trailing off as people looked up from their phones and magazines to observe the unfolding tension. Victoria didn't wait for a flight attendant to mediate the situation. She stepped directly into Damon's personal space and tapped him firmly on the shoulder, a gesture that was both physically invasive and clearly intended to establish her presumed authority over the interaction that was about to unfold. Damon slowly removed his noise-canceling headphones and looked up at Victoria with the kind of measured expression that comes from years of managing difficult conversations in high-stakes business environments. He could feel the attention of nearby passengers focusing on their interaction, the ambient cabin noise seeming to drop several decibels as people sensed that they were about to witness something significant unfold in the normally peaceful first-class environment. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice calm and polite, but carrying an undertone of controlled authority that Victoria was too focused on her own agenda to recognize. "You're in my seat," Victoria announced, her tone suggesting that this was a simple statement of fact rather than the opening move in what was about to become a much larger confrontation. She stood with her arms crossed, her posture radiating the kind of confidence that comes from a lifetime of having people accommodate her demands rather than challenge her assumptions. "I specifically reserved 2A when I booked this flight, and I need you to move so I can get settled before takeoff." Damon glanced down at his boarding pass, though he knew perfectly well what it said, and then back up at Victoria with an expression of polite confusion. "I'm sorry, but I think there might be some mistake. My boarding pass clearly shows seat 2A, and I checked in for this flight yesterday." "Are you sure you're looking at the right row?" Victoria let out a sharp laugh that had nothing to do with humor and everything to do with the kind of dismissive superiority that she'd learned to use as a weapon against people she considered beneath her station. "Look, I don't know how you managed to end up in this seat. Maybe there was some kind of computer error, or maybe you used frequent flyer miles for an upgrade you couldn't actually afford. But I actually paid for this flight full fare, and I have work to do that requires the privacy and space that this particular seat provides." The words hung in the air like smoke, carrying implications that were becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Other passengers were no longer pretending to mind their own business. The elderly businessman had folded his newspaper and was watching with obvious disapproval. The young couple had stopped taking selfies and were staring with wide-eyed fascination, and even passengers in the economy section who were still boarding were slowing their pace to observe the unfolding drama. "Ma'am, I also paid full fare for this seat." Damon replied, his voice remaining level despite the growing tension in the cabin. "And I'm quite comfortable here, so I think we should probably call a flight attendant to help sort out any confusion about the seating assignments." Victoria's expression shifted from condescending patience to barely controlled irritation, and she leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice to what she probably thought was a confidential tone, but was actually loud enough for several nearby passengers to hear every word. "I don't think you understand the situation here. I am a Diamond Medallion member with this airline. My family has been flying with them for over 20 years, and when I tell you that this seat belongs to me, I expect you to acknowledge that fact and move to whatever section you actually belong in." She reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a crisp $100 bill, holding it between her manicured fingers like it was a magic wand that could solve any problem through the simple application of money to people she assumed were desperate enough to be bought. "Here," she said, waving the bill near Damon's face with the casual arrogance of someone who'd never considered that not everyone in the world could be purchased for the right price. "Take this and go back to seat 6B. The drinks are complimentary back there too, and honestly, you'll probably be more comfortable with people who are more like you." The cabin went absolutely silent. The phrase "people who are more like you" seemed to echo in the recycled air like a verbal slap carrying racial implications that were impossible to misinterpret, and turning what had been a seating dispute into something much more serious. The businessman across the aisle made a disgusted sound and shook his head visibly. The young couple looked shocked and uncomfortable, and even passengers still boarding from economy had stopped moving to stare at the unfolding confrontation. Damon looked at the $100 bill, then slowly raised his eyes to meet Victoria's gaze with an expression that had transformed from polite confusion to something much colder and more dangerous. "Put your money away," he said softly, each word carefully measured and carrying a weight that seemed to make the air around them feel thicker. "And please step out of my personal space." Victoria's face flushed red, a color that clashed dramatically with her cream-colored Armani suit, as she realized that her usual arsenal of intimidation tactics wasn't producing the immediate compliance she'd come to expect from people she considered her social inferiors. She'd spent her entire adult life operating under the assumption that the combination of money, status symbols, and sheer force of personality could overcome any obstacle, and the fact that this particular obstacle was refusing to budge was causing her carefully constructed worldview to develop some very dangerous cracks. "Excuse me," she called out loudly, snapping her fingers with the theatrical authority of someone summoning a servant. "Flight attendant. We have a problem here that needs to be resolved immediately." Maria Santos hurried over from the galley where she'd been preparing for the pre-flight service, her expression shifting from professional pleasantness to concerned attention as she took in the scene. A well-dressed white woman standing aggressively over a seated black passenger, with other travelers watching nervously from their surrounding seats. "Yes, ma'am. How can I help you?" Maria asked, though her experienced eye was already assessing the body language and tension levels that suggested this situation was about to escalate beyond a simple seating misunderstanding. "This man is refusing to move from the seat I specifically reserved," Victoria announced, gesturing at Damon like he was an inanimate object that had been misplaced rather than a human being with his own legitimate claim to the space. "I don't know how he ended up here. Probably some kind of computer error or system malfunction, but I need him moved to his proper section so I can get settled in my correct seat." Maria glanced at Damon, who remained seated calmly but was watching the interaction with the kind of focused attention that suggested he was processing far more information than Victoria realized. "Sir, could I see your boarding pass, please?" she asked politely. Damon handed over his boarding pass without comment, and Maria examined it carefully before looking back at Victoria. "Ma'am, this gentleman's pass clearly shows seat 2A, and our computer system confirms that he checked in yesterday for this specific seat assignment. Your reservation shows seat 6B, which is also a first-class seat with identical amenities. Would you like me to help you get settled there?" Victoria's voice rose to a pitch that was becoming genuinely uncomfortable for everyone within earshot. "No, I don't want to be settled in 6B. I want this situation handled properly. Look at him. Does he look like someone who belongs in first class? He's obviously had some kind of system error work in his favor, or maybe he's an employee flying on some kind of reduced fare. But I actually paid for this seat, and I expect to get what I paid for." The implications in her words were becoming increasingly explicit, and the cabin atmosphere was shifting from uncomfortable to genuinely hostile as other passengers began to react with visible disgust and disapproval. The elderly businessman across the aisle was glaring at Victoria with undisguised contempt. The young couple was whispering urgently to each other while shooting worried glances at the confrontation, and even passengers still making their way through the cabin from economy were stopping to stare at what was becoming a very public display of entitlement and prejudice. "Ma'am, I need you to lower your voice and return to your assigned seat," Maria said firmly, her professional training kicking in as she recognized that this situation was moving beyond customer service into potential safety concerns. "All passengers have valid tickets and seat assignments, and I can't move people based on personal preferences." Victoria whirled around to face Maria directly, her composure finally cracking completely as she realized that the normal social hierarchies she relied on weren't functioning in this environment. "Don't you dare tell me what to do. Do you know who I am? I am Victoria Ashworth. I am the VP of Marketing for Lux Essence, and my husband is Bradford Ashworth of Ashworth Law. We have connections throughout this industry, and when I tell you that there's been a mistake with seating assignments, I expect you to fix it immediately." She pointed an accusatory finger at Damon, her voice rising to a level that was definitely disturbing passengers throughout the first-class cabin. "Check his identification. I guarantee you that's not even his real name on the reservation. People like him are always using fake names or stolen credit cards to upgrade themselves into sections they don't belong in. This is probably some kind of fraud, and you're going to be responsible when the airline finds out you let it happen." The accusations hung in the air like toxic smoke, transforming what had been an uncomfortable social situation into something approaching a genuine crisis. Damon slowly closed his book and placed it on the tray table in front of him, the deliberate nature of his movements suggesting that something significant was about to change in the dynamic of this confrontation. "Maria," he said quietly, addressing the flight attendant by name in a way that seemed to carry more authority than Victoria's shouting as the cockpit door still open. Maria blinked in confusion, clearly not understanding why he was asking about cockpit access in the middle of a seating dispute. "Yes, sir. The captain is still completing his pre-flight checks." "Why do you ask?" Damon unbuckled his seatbelt and began to stand up, his 6-foot frame unfolding with the kind of controlled power that suddenly made the cabin feel much smaller and more charged with potential energy. "Because I think we need to have a conversation with Captain Morrison, and it's not going to be about the seating arrangement." Victoria laughed with genuine triumph, clapping her hands together like a child who'd just gotten her way after a prolonged tantrum. Finally, "Yes, go ahead and get the captain. Captain Morrison and I are old friends. I've flown with him dozens of times, and he'll straighten this whole mess out immediately. Go ahead, run along and get him. You're doing me a favor by finally admitting you don't belong here." Damon reached into the inner pocket of his navy blazer with the deliberate calm of someone who was about to fundamentally alter the trajectory of everyone's day, though Victoria was still too caught up in her sense of impending victory to recognize the shift in atmospheric pressure that was occurring around her. The other passengers, however, were beginning to sense that something significant was about to happen. Conversations throughout the first-class cabin had stopped entirely, and even the boarding process behind them seemed to slow as people sensed the buildup of dramatic tension. What Damon pulled from his jacket wasn't a wallet or identification card, Instead, he produced a matte black card slightly larger than a credit card, with no photograph or personal information visible, just a silver magnetic strip running along one edge and a holographic logo embossed in the center. The distinctive falcon emblem of Apex Airways, rendered in security ink that shifted colors when viewed from different angles. He held the card up so Maria could see it clearly, and the flight attendant's eyes immediately went wide with recognition and shock. Her hand flew to her mouth in an involuntary gesture of surprise, and she took an instinctive step backward as the full implications of what she was seeing began to register in her mind. "Mr. Hayes," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the ambient cabin noise. I had no idea you were on board today. No one informed the crew." Victoria was still basking in her anticipated triumph, completely oblivious to the seismic shift that had just occurred in the power dynamics of the situation. "See, I told you this would get sorted out quickly once the right people got involved. Now can we please get this man moved to wherever he actually belongs so I can get settled in my proper seat, Ms. Ashworth?" Maria said, her voice carrying a new note of gravity that should have been a warning signal if Victoria had been paying attention to anything other than her own sense of vindication. "I think you need to understand exactly who you've been talking to." But Victoria was too caught up in her moment of triumph to process the change in Maria's tone or the shocked expressions on the faces of nearby passengers who were beginning to recognize what the holographic Falcon logo represented. "I don't care who he thinks he is," she declared loudly. "If his name was Barack Obama, I'd still want him moved out of my seat." Damon turned to Maria with an expression that was calm but carried an unmistakable note of command authority. "Please inform Captain Morrison that Damon Hayes is in the cabin and requests his immediate presence. Also, please ask him to shut down the auxiliary power unit. We're not going anywhere until this situation is properly resolved." The words "shut down the auxiliary power unit" seemed to echo through the cabin like a thunderclap, causing several passengers to look up in alarm as they realized that whatever was happening was serious enough to potentially delay their departure. Victoria finally began to sense that something had shifted in the conversation, though she still hadn't grasped the magnitude of what was occurring. "What do you mean, shut down the power?" she demanded, her voice taking on a slightly hysterical edge. "You can't just order the crew around like that. Who do you think you are?" Maria was already moving toward the cockpit with the urgent efficiency of someone who'd suddenly realized she was dealing with a situation far above her pay grade. The cabin lights flickered slightly as the auxiliary power unit wound down, and the subtle vibration that passengers usually didn't notice until it stopped began to fade away, leaving the aircraft feeling strangely still and quiet. "Ladies and gentlemen," a voice crackled over the intercom system, though it wasn't Maria or any of the flight attendants speaking. "This is Captain Morrison. We are experiencing a brief delay due to a security situation in the cabin that requires immediate attention. Please remain seated while we address this matter. We apologize for any inconvenience." The word "security situation" rippled through the cabin like wildfire, causing concerned murmurs and worried conversations to break out among passengers who were suddenly wondering if they should be frightened about whatever was happening in the first-class section. Victoria looked around with growing alarm, finally beginning to realize that she might have seriously miscalculated the situation she'd inserted herself into. The cockpit door swung open with more force than usual, and Captain James Morrison emerged with the bearing of someone who'd been flying commercial aircraft for over 25 years and was accustomed to handling emergency situations with calm professionalism. He was a man in his late 50s with graying temples and the kind of steady presence that reassured passengers during turbulence. But his expression as he scanned the first-class cabin suggested that he was prepared to deal with whatever crisis was serious enough to require shutting down aircraft systems. His eyes swept across the cabin, taking in the tense postures and worried expressions of passengers, before settling on the tall man standing in the aisle near seat 2A. Captain Morrison's face went through a rapid transformation from professional alertness to recognition to something approaching shock, and his entire posture shifted from crisis management to something much closer to military attention. "Mr. Hayes," Captain Morrison said, his voice carrying a note of respect that was impossible to miss. "Sir, I wasn't informed that you were traveling with us today. If I had known, I would have ensured that your journey was completely undisturbed." Victoria's mouth fell open as the final pieces of the puzzle began to click into place, though her mind was still struggling to accept what was becoming increasingly obvious to everyone else in the cabin. "Wait," she said, her voice suddenly much smaller and less confident than it had been moments earlier. You know him?" Captain Morrison removed his cap in a gesture of respect that seemed to make the entire cabin fall silent, as if every passenger was suddenly holding their breath to see what would happen next in this unprecedented drama unfolding at 30,000 feet above normal social conventions and expectations. His weathered face, marked by decades of navigating aircraft through storms and emergencies, now carried an expression of barely controlled concern as he processed the implications of what had apparently been happening in his cabin while he was focused on pre-flight preparations. "Mrs. Ashworth," Captain Morrison said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from years of making split-second decisions in high-pressure situations. "I need you to understand that you are currently addressing Damon Hayes, who is not just a passenger on this aircraft. He is the chairman and chief executive officer of Apex Airways, which means he owns this airline, this airplane, and has ultimate responsibility for the safety and security of every person in this cabin." The words seemed to hit Victoria like a physical blow, causing her to stagger backward and catch herself against the bulkhead wall as the full magnitude of her mistake began to register in her mind. Her carefully constructed world of assumed superiority was crumbling in real time, and the expressions of shock and disgust on the faces of surrounding passengers told her that her humiliation was being witnessed by dozens of people who would undoubtedly be sharing this story for years to come. That's impossible," Victoria whispered, her voice barely audible as she looked between Captain Morrison and Damon, with the desperate hope that this was somehow an elaborate misunderstanding that could still be explained away. Look at him. He's wearing a t-shirt under that blazer. His bag looks like it came from a thrift store. He was reading a paperback book instead of working on business documents." Damon finally spoke, his voice calm and measured, but carrying an unmistakable note of authority that seemed to fill the cabin and command attention from every passenger within hearing distance. "Captain Morrison, I apologize for disrupting your pre-flight schedule, but we have encountered a serious security issue that needs to be addressed before this aircraft moves another inch." Security issue, Sir Captain Morrison asked, his training immediately shifting him into crisis management mode as he prepared to deal with whatever threat had been identified. "This passenger," Damon said, gesturing calmly toward Victoria, without any trace of anger or vindictiveness in his voice, "has attempted to bribe a fellow passenger, made explicitly racial statements about my presence in this cabin, used abusive language toward your crew, and threatened to use her family connections to damage the careers of airline employees who were simply doing their jobs according to established policies and procedures." He paused, letting the weight of the accusations settle in the cabin before continuing. "She has created a hostile environment that makes me genuinely concerned about the safety and comfort of other passengers, and if the CEO of an airline doesn't feel secure flying on his own aircraft because of a passenger's behavior, then I think we can safely assume that passenger represents a significant risk to everyone else on board." Victoria's face had gone from red to a sickly pale color as she realized that every word she'd spoken, every assumption she'd made, and every demand she'd voiced had been heard not just by other passengers, but by the owner of the airline himself. I never said anything racist," she stammered, her voice taking on a desperate quality as she tried to reconstruct the conversation in a way that might minimize her culpability. "I just wanted my seat. I offered him money to switch. That's not bribery, that's just normal passenger negotiations. The elderly businessman across the aisle made a sound of disgust and shook his head emphatically. Ma'am, I heard every word you said, and what you did was absolutely unacceptable. You made assumptions about this gentleman based on his race. You offered him money like he was some kind of servant you could buy, and you told him he should sit with people more like him. That's not passenger negotiation. That's discrimination, plain and simple. Other passengers began to speak up their voices, creating a chorus of disapproval that seemed to surround Victoria like an accusatory cloud. The young couple behind Damon nodded in agreement. Several passengers from economy who had witnessed the confrontation while boarding murmured their support for the businessman's assessment, and even Maria, the flight attendant, stepped forward to address Captain Morrison directly. Sir, I can confirm everything Mr. Hayes has described, Maria said, her voice steady despite the obvious stress of the situation. Miss Ashworth made several statements that I would definitely classify as discriminatory. She physically invaded Mr. Hayes's personal space, despite his requests for her to step back, and she threatened to use her husband's legal connections to have my job terminated if I didn't force Mr. Hayes to move to a different seat. Captain Morrison's expression had transformed from professional concern to barely controlled anger as he processed the full scope of what had apparently occurred while he was preparing for departure. In 25 years of flying commercial aircraft, he had dealt with drunk passengers, disruptive travelers, and even occasional medical emergencies, but he had never encountered a situation where a passenger had unknowingly targeted the owner of the airline with racially motivated harassment. Ms. Ashworth, Captain Morrison said, his voice carrying the kind of finality that comes when someone in authority has made a decision that is not open for debate or discussion. You are no longer welcome on this aircraft. I am calling Port Authority Police to escort you from the plane, and you will be banned from flying on any Apex Airways subsidiary for the foreseeable future. Victoria's world was collapsing so rapidly that she seemed unable to process the full implications of what was happening to her. But her survival instincts kicked in with the kind of desperate energy that people display when they realize their entire carefully constructed life is about to come crashing down around them. She pulled out her phone with shaking hands and began frantically dialing, her voice taking on the high-pitched quality of someone who was teetering on the edge of complete panic. Bradford, you need to get down here right now, she said into the phone, her words tumbling over each other in her haste to summon whatever help she could mobilize before the situation spiraled completely beyond her control. I'm on the plane, and there's some kind of misunderstanding with a passenger who's claiming to be important, and the captain is threatening to have me arrested. You need to bring your legal credentials and get this sorted out immediately. What Victoria didn't realize as she was making her desperate phone call was that Damon Hayes had been using the brief delay to conduct some research of his own. His phone was connected to the aircraft's business-class Wi-Fi system, and his access to corporate databases and professional networks had allowed him to pull up detailed information about Victoria Ashworth, her husband Bradford, and the web of business relationships that had apparently given them the confidence to believe they could intimidate their way through any situation. Captain Morrison Damon said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that comes from having information that other people don't know they need to be worried about. I think you should know that we're about to have another visitor. Mrs. Ashworth's husband Bradford is apparently on his way to join this conversation, and based on what I've been able to research about him in the last few minutes, I suspect he's going to escalate this situation rather than help resolve it. True to Damon's prediction, the sound of heavy footsteps on the jet bridge announced the arrival of someone who was clearly approaching the aircraft with the same kind of aggressive energy that Victoria had brought to her seating dispute. Bradford Ashworth burst through the aircraft door like a man on a mission to rescue his wife from what he'd obviously been led to believe was some kind of scam or misunderstanding that could be resolved through the application of legal threats and social intimidation. Bradford was a man in his late 40s who wore his success like armor, his expensive suit tailored to Project Authority, and his posture radiating the kind of confidence that comes from spending decades in courtrooms and boardrooms where he'd learned that the loudest voice and the most expensive attorney usually determined the outcome of any dispute. He scanned the first-class cabin with the assessing gaze of someone looking for opponents to intimidate, and his eyes settled on Damon with the same kind of dismissive calculation that had gotten his wife into this situation in the first place. "Where is my wife, and what exactly is going on here?" Bradford demanded, his voice carrying the prosecutorial tone he'd developed during years of cross-examining witnesses and intimidating opposing counsel. "Victoria called me from this aircraft claiming that some passenger was harassing her, and that the crew was threatening to have her arrested for requesting her assigned seat. I want to speak to whoever is in charge, and I want this situation resolved immediately." Captain Morrison stepped forward, his expression suggesting that his patience was already running thin after dealing with Victoria's behavior, and that Bradford's aggressive entrance was not improving his mood. "Mr. Ashworth, I presume your wife created a disturbance in the cabin by harassing another passenger with racially motivated comments and threats. She's being removed from the aircraft for the safety and comfort of other travelers." Bradford's laugh was sharp and dismissive, the kind of sound that defense attorneys make when they think they've spotted a weakness in the prosecution's case that they can exploit for their client's benefit. "Racially motivated. That's absolutely ridiculous. My wife isn't racist. She was simply trying to claim the seat she'd reserved and paid for. And I think you'll find that removing paying customers based on false accusations is going to result in a very expensive lawsuit for this airline." He turned toward Damon with the kind of predatory focus that suggested he'd identified the person he considered responsible for his wife's troubles. "And you must be the passenger who's been causing problems for my wife. I don't know what kind of game you're trying to play here, but I am Bradford Ashworth of Ashworth Law. We represent several major corporate clients in the aviation industry, and I can have this aircraft grounded for maintenance issues with one phone call to the right federal inspector." The threat hung in the air like a challenge, and Bradford stepped closer to Damon with the kind of physical intimidation tactics that had probably served him well in legal negotiations, but were spectacularly inappropriate for the current situation. "Now I suggest you apologize to my wife for whatever misunderstanding occurred, move to whatever seat you actually belong in, and allow this flight to proceed before you find yourself facing legal consequences that you're probably not equipped to handle." Damon looked at Bradford with the same measuring expression he'd used on Victoria, and then reached into his jacket pocket for the second time that day. "Mr. Ashworth," he said calmly, "since you mentioned your legal clients in the aviation industry, I'm curious to know if Apex Airways is one of the companies your firm represents." Bradford's expression shifted slightly, suggesting that the question had caught him off guard in a way that made him momentarily uncertain about the direction the conversation was taking. "Yes, actually, Ashworth Law has been handling some contract work for Apex Airways' Regulatory Compliance Division." "Why is that relevant to this situation?" "Because Damon said, pulling out his phone and scrolling through his contacts with deliberate calm, I'd like to call your senior partner and discuss whether your current behavior represents the kind of professional conduct that Apex Airways expects from its legal representatives." The phone call connected on speaker, and a voice answered that carried the kind of authority that comes from decades of managing a major law firm and maintaining relationships with high-value corporate clients. "Ashworth Law. This is Jonathan. Ashworth speaking." "Mr. Ashworth," Damon said, his voice carrying a note of formal courtesy that seemed to fill the cabin and command attention from every passenger who was witnessing this unprecedented confrontation. "This is Damon Hayes, CEO of Apex Airways. I'm currently on one of my aircraft dealing with a situation involving your son, Bradford, and his wife, Victoria, and I think you need to hear exactly what's been happening." The silence that followed Damon's introduction was so complete that passengers could hear the distant sound of ground equipment operating outside the aircraft, the electronic hum of cabin systems, and even their own heartbeats as they waited to see how this unprecedented situation would resolve itself. Bradford's face had gone through several color changes, from confident aggression to confused uncertainty to growing alarm, as he began to understand that he had significantly miscalculated both the situation and the person he'd chosen to threaten. Damon Hayes came the voice through the phone speaker, carrying a note of respect that made it clear that Jonathan Ashworth understood exactly who he was speaking to and what was at stake in this conversation. "To what do I owe the honor? I thought you were traveling to Europe today for the Pinnacle merger meetings." "I am, Jonathan, but we have a situation that I think requires your immediate attention," Damon replied, his voice maintaining the kind of calm professionalism that business leaders use when they're about to deliver news that is going to fundamentally change someone's day. "Your son Bradford is currently on my aircraft, threatening me with legal action and federal regulatory interference because his wife Victoria was removed from the flight for racially harassing passengers and crew members." The pause that followed was long enough for everyone in the cabin to understand that Jonathan Ashworth was processing information that he found both shocking and deeply concerning. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of barely controlled panic that suggested he understood the magnitude of damage that his family members had potentially caused to one of his firm's most important client relationships. "Bradford, what the hell are you doing?" Jonathan's voice cut through the speaker with the kind of authority that comes from someone who'd spent decades building a legal practice and was watching his son potentially destroy it in real time. "Please tell me that you did not just threaten Damon Hayes with regulatory retaliation." Bradford was staring at the phone like it was a venomous snake, his confident posture collapsing as he realized that his intimidation tactics had not only failed spectacularly but had placed his family's professional reputation in serious jeopardy. "Dad, I didn't know. Victoria called me and said some passenger was harassing her." "Some passenger," Damon interrupted quietly. "Mr. Ashworth, your son, just informed me that he could have this aircraft grounded with one phone call to the right federal inspector. He also demanded that I apologize to his wife for what he called a misunderstanding, despite the fact that multiple witnesses heard her make explicitly racial comments about my presence in first class." Jonathan Ashworth's voice, when he responded, carried the kind of cold fury that comes from someone who'd spent decades building professional relationships only to watch family members potentially destroy everything in a matter of minutes. "Bradford, you and Victoria are off the Apex Airways account effective immediately. You're also suspended from the firm pending a full review of this incident. And Mr. Hayes, please accept my sincere apologies for the unprofessional conduct of my family members." Victoria had been standing frozen during this conversation, but the words "suspended from the firm" seemed to snap her out of her shock and back into desperate action. "Wait!" she shrieked, her voice taking on a hysterical quality that made several passengers flinch. "You can't destroy our careers over a simple seating misunderstanding. I never said anything racist. I just wanted the seat I'd reserved." "Ma'am," said a new voice from the aircraft doorway. "I'm Officer Martinez with Port Authority Police, and I need you to come with me." Two uniformed officers had boarded the aircraft while everyone was focused on the phone conversation, and they approached Victoria with the kind of professional calm that comes from years of dealing with disruptive passengers and airport disturbances. Victoria looked around the cabin desperately, as if searching for someone who might be willing to vouch for her version of events, but the faces staring back at her ranged from disgusted to angry to simply uncomfortable with witnessing her complete public meltdown. "This is insane," she shouted, her voice echoing through the cabin as the officers moved to escort her toward the exit. "I'm being arrested for trying to sit in my assigned seat." "Actually, ma'am," Officer Martinez said calmly, "you're being detained for disturbing the peacemaking, terroristic threats against airline personnel and creating a public disturbance. You have the right to remain silent." As the officers began reading Victoria her rights, Bradford made one last, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of his family's situation. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice taking on a pleading quality that was completely different from the aggressive threats he'd made just minutes earlier. "Surely we can work something out here." Victoria was just having a bad day. She's been under a lot of stress lately, and I'm sure if we could just discuss this privately. Damon looked at Bradford with an expression that was neither angry nor vindictive, but carried a finality that made it clear the conversation was over. Mr. Ashworth, your wife didn't just have a bad day. She revealed her character, and your response to her behavior revealed yours. The best thing you can do now is call a lawyer, one who doesn't work for your father, and prepare for the consequences of your choices. The aircraft door closed behind the departing police officers with a sound that seemed to mark the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Captain Morrison returned to the cockpit to restart the aircraft systems and prepare for departure, while Maria and the other flight attendants began the process of resetting the cabin atmosphere and helping passengers process what they just witnessed. But as the auxiliary power unit wound back up and the cabin lights returned to their normal soft blue glow, Damon Hayes was already thinking several moves ahead. He knew that people like Victoria and Bradford Ashworth didn't simply disappear quietly. They retaliated, they spun narratives, and they used every resource at their disposal to avoid accepting responsibility for their actions. The real battle, he suspected, was just beginning. The flight to Geneva proceeded smoothly once the aircraft was finally cleared for departure. But while Damon Hayes was 37,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean, the world below was catching fire with a viral social media storm that was spreading faster than anyone could have anticipated. Victoria Ashworth, released on her own, recognizance pending a court appearance, had not gone quietly into the night, as her lawyers had undoubtedly advised her to do. Instead, she had gone straight to her phone and begun crafting what she believed would be a masterpiece of victim narrative that would transform her from aggressor to sympathetic figure in the court of public opinion. The video she posted from the back seat of her Uber shot, with the kind of careful lighting and camera angles that suggested she understood the performative nature of social media better than she understood basic human decency, was a masterclass in strategic manipulation. Her hair was artfully disheveled. Her makeup was smudged just enough to suggest genuine distress without making her look unattractive, and her voice carried exactly the right combination of vulnerability and indignation to appeal to people who wanted to believe that successful women were constantly under attack by forces beyond their control. "I can't believe I have to make this video," Victoria said into her phone camera, her voice trembling with what appeared to be genuine emotion, but was actually carefully calculated performance art. "I was just trying to fly home from a business trip, sitting in the seat that my company had specifically reserved for me, when this man, this very large, very intimidating man, started screaming at me and threatening me because he wanted my seat for himself." The lies came so smoothly and naturally that anyone watching who hadn't witnessed the actual events might have found her story completely credible. She described Damon as aggressive and threatening, claimed that he'd used his position as a wealthy businessman to have her falsely arrested, and painted herself as the victim of a system that allowed rich men to abuse women who were just trying to travel safely. "He told me that people like me, meaning white women, needed to learn our place in his world." Victoria continued, her voice rising with apparent indignation as she attributed words to Damon that he had never spoken. "He said he owned the airline, so he owned me, and when I tried to call for help, he used his influence to have me arrested. This is what happens when billionaires think they can treat women like property just because they have more money than we do." By the time Damon's flight touched down in Geneva, Victoria's video had been viewed over 2 million times, shared by thousands of accounts, and had spawned a hashtag campaign called #BillionaireBully that was trending in 12 countries. The narrative she'd constructed played perfectly into existing social tensions about wealth, inequality, gender dynamics, and corporate power, and her strategic decision to frame the incident as an attack on working women by entitled billionaires had resonated with people who were predisposed to believe that the wealthy routinely abused their power to harm ordinary citizens. The media circus waiting for Damon at Geneva International Airport was unlike anything he'd experienced in 15 years of running a public company. Reporters with cameras and microphones created a wall of aggressive attention that his security team had to navigate like a military operation while shouted questions about assault allegations. Discrimination charges and abuse of power created a cacophony that seemed designed to prevent any coherent response to the accusations swirling around him. "Mr. Hayes, is it true that you physically threatened a female passenger?" One reporter shouted above the crowd noise while another demanded, "What's your response to allegations that you used racial slurs against Ms. Ashworth?" The questions were loaded with assumptions that had no basis in reality, but the cumulative effect was to create an atmosphere where Damon appeared to be dodging serious charges rather than simply trying to travel through an airport without being mobbed by people who had already decided he was guilty of whatever crimes they'd been told he'd committed. Damon's security team, Swiss professionals, who specialized in protecting high-profile business executives from exactly this kind of media attention, carved a path through the crowd with efficient precision. But one particularly aggressive tabloid reporter managed to block their route toward the waiting vehicles. "Comment on the video, Mr. Hayes," the reporter demanded, shoving a microphone toward Damon's face. "Victoria Ashworth says she feared for her life. How do you respond to a woman who says you terrorized her?" Damon stopped walking and looked directly into the camera lens, his expression calm but carrying an undercurrent of controlled authority that seemed to cut through the chaos around them. "The truth has a way of rising above lies," he said, his voice clear and measured despite the surrounding noise. "Wait for the black box." The cryptic response only fueled more speculation and conspiracy theories, but Damon had learned long ago that responding to false accusations with detailed denials usually just gave the accusations more credibility and media attention. Instead, he got into his waiting car and began implementing a strategy that would turn Victoria's lies into the instrument of her own destruction. During the drive to his Geneva hotel, Damon was already on the phone with his crisis management team, his legal counsel, and the Apex Airways corporate communications department, coordinating a response that would be both comprehensive and devastating. But the centerpiece of his strategy was timing. He wanted Victoria to commit fully to her false narrative, to repeat her lies in as many public forums as possible before he released the evidence that would not only prove her dishonesty, but demonstrate the calculated nature of her deception. "Let her go on television," Damon instructed his communications director during their video conference call. "Let her tell her story to as many reporters and talk show hosts as possible. The deeper she digs this hole, the more spectacular her fall will be when we reveal what actually happened." By morning, Victoria had accepted an invitation to appear on one of America's most popular morning television shows, where she would have the opportunity to tell her story to an audience of millions and cement her position as the victim in this narrative. What she didn't realize was that she was about to walk into a trap that would not only destroy her credibility but expose the larger pattern of corruption and entitlement that had led to this moment. 6 months after Victoria Ashworth's arrest at JFK Airport, the consequences of that August afternoon had rippled outward like stones thrown into still water, creating waves of change that reached far beyond anyone involved could have anticipated. When the first angry words were spoken in Seat 2A, the federal courthouse in Brooklyn had become the epicenter of a legal earthquake that was reshaping not just the lives of the individuals involved, but the entire landscape of corporate accountability and personal responsibility in the aviation industry. Victoria sat in the defendant's chair wearing an orange jumpsuit that was a far cry from her cream Armani suit, listening as federal judge Patricia Williams delivered a sentence that would define the next chapter of her life. The charges against her had expanded far beyond the initial airport disturbance. The FBI's investigation into her family's business dealings had uncovered a web of corruption involving airport contracts, regulatory manipulation, and influence peddling that stretched back over 15 years and implicated dozens of other individuals in positions of power and authority. Ms. Ashworth, Judge Williams, said, her voice carrying the weight of someone who'd spent decades watching privileged individuals learn that their wealth and connections couldn't shield them from the consequences of criminal behavior. You have been found guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud, bribery of public officials, and civil rights violations. The evidence presented in this case shows a pattern of behavior that goes far beyond a simple airline incident. It reveals a systematic abuse of power and privilege that this court cannot ignore. The 18-month federal prison sentence was just the beginning of Victoria's reckoning. Her conviction had triggered a cascade of civil lawsuits, regulatory investigations, and professional consequences that had stripped away every layer of the carefully constructed life she'd built through family connections and corporate manipulation. Her husband Bradford had already been disbarred and was serving his own reduced sentence after agreeing to cooperate with federal investigators, while his father Jonathan's law firm was facing bankruptcy as major clients fled in the wake of the corruption revelations. But the most significant changes were happening far from any courtroom. Damon Hayes had used the spotlight created by Victoria's false accusations to launch a comprehensive initiative addressing discrimination and accountability throughout the aviation industry, working with congressional leaders, civil rights organizations, and industry associations to create new standards for passenger treatment and employee training that were being adopted by airlines around the world. The Hayes Protocols, as they'd become known in industry circles, established clear guidelines for handling conflicts between passengers, mandatory bias training for all customer-facing employees, and transparent reporting mechanisms for discrimination complaints that made it impossible for airlines to quietly sweep problematic behavior under the rug. More importantly, the protocols created personal accountability for airline executives, making them directly responsible for the culture and practices of their organizations in ways that had previously been avoided through corporate structure and legal distance. Change doesn't happen because people suddenly become better. Damon had testified before a congressional subcommittee on transportation equity 3 months after the incident. Change happens when the cost of staying the same becomes higher than the cost of transformation, and when leaders take personal responsibility for creating environments where dignity and respect aren't luxuries that some passengers have to earn, but basic rights that every traveler can expect. The financial impact on Apex Airways had been initially concerning. Stock prices had fluctuated wildly during the weeks when Victoria's false narrative dominated news cycles, and several major investors had expressed concerns about the company's public image and leadership stability. But as the truth emerged and Damon's proactive response demonstrated genuine commitment to positive change, rather than defensive damage control, the company's reputation and market position had actually strengthened significantly. Corporate clients began specifically requesting Apex Airways for their executive travel, citing the company's demonstrated commitment to treating all passengers with dignity, regardless of their race background or apparent economic status. The airline's customer satisfaction scores reached record highs as passengers responded to training and policy changes that prioritized genuine service over performative politeness, and employee retention improved dramatically as workers felt supported by management in maintaining professional standards without fear of retaliation from demanding customers. 1 year after the incident that had changed so many lives, Dr. Aisha Williams was rushing through Geneva International Airport with the kind of controlled urgency that comes from years of medical training and the constant awareness that other people's lives often depend on decisions made in moments of crisis. She was returning from a pediatric surgery conference where she'd presented her research on trauma treatment protocols for children work that had grown directly out of the confidence and sense of possibility that had been planted during a difficult flight, when a stranger had seen her potential and given her the space to flourish. Aisha's life had transformed dramatically since that August evening when Victoria Ashworth's removal from Flight 847 had opened up Seat 6B and given her the rest and space she'd needed to arrive in Geneva prepared for the interview that launched her career. She'd completed her residency with honors, specializing in pediatric trauma surgery, with a focus on treating children from underserved communities, and was now heading back to Chicago to begin her fellowship at one of the country's most prestigious children's hospitals. But more than her professional success, what had changed most profoundly was her understanding of her own worth and place in the world. The moment when Damon Hayes had invited her to move from her cramped coach seat to first class hadn't just been about physical comfort. It had been about recognition, about someone in a position of power acknowledging that her dreams and aspirations were valuable enough to deserve support and investment. As she approached her departure gate, scanning the boarding information to confirm her flight details, Aisha heard a familiar voice behind her and turned to see a face she'd hoped she might encounter during her layover, but hadn't been sure she'd have the chance to find in the vast anonymity of international travel. Dr. Williams Damon Hayes said with a warm smile that transformed his usually serious expression into something much more personal and genuine. "I was hoping our paths might cross here." How was the conference? The reunion was emotional in ways that neither of them had fully anticipated. For Aisha, seeing Damon represented the completion of a circle that had begun with her studying for medical board exams in a cramped middle seat and was ending with her returning home as a successful physician with opportunities and possibilities that she'd barely dared to imagine just 12 months earlier. For Damon, the encounter was a reminder that the most important changes often happen not in boardrooms or courtrooms, but in individual moments when people choose to see and support the potential in others. "Mr. Hayes, Aisha," said her voice carrying a mixture of gratitude and professional confidence that reflected both how far she'd traveled and how much she'd grown. "I can never thank you enough for what you did. Not just the seat upgrade, though that rest made all the difference for my interview, but for showing me that I belonged in that space, that I didn't have to apologize for taking up room in places where I'd earned the right to be." They talked for 20 minutes about her work, her plans for the fellowship, and the scholarship program that Apex Airways had established in both their names to support medical students from underrepresented communities who were pursuing careers in healthcare. The Dr. Aisha Williams Memorial Fund, as it had been officially named, despite Aisha's embarrassed protests that she wasn't dead and didn't need a memorial, had already provided assistance to over 50 students and was growing into a significant force for increasing diversity in medical education. "You know what the most important thing is," Aisha said, as their conversation began to wind down, and they both prepared to board their respective flights. "It's not just that you helped me that day. It's that now I look for opportunities to do the same thing for other people. I see students struggling in the hospital residence who are doubting whether they belong there, and I remember that someone saw potential in me when I needed it most. That's how change really spreads, not through policies or programs, but through people who decide to lift others up." 2 hours later, Damon Hayes was settling into seat 2A on Apex Airways Flight 847, the same route that had become the epicenter of a national conversation about dignity, justice, and the power of individual actions to create lasting change. The anniversary was intentional. He'd specifically booked this flight on this date because he wanted to mark the moment not with speeches or ceremonies, but with the simple act of continuing to fly commercial and maintaining his connection to the ground-level experience of air travel that kept him grounded in the reality of his customers' lives. The cabin was filling with the usual mixture of business travelers, families, and tourists, all going about the ordinary business of getting from one place to another without any awareness that they were sitting in a space that had become symbolic of something much larger than transportation. The first-class section looked exactly as it had a year ago. Same blue LED lighting, same leather seats, same quiet electronic hum of aircraft systems preparing for departure. As Damon arranged his belongings and prepared for the flight back to New York, he noticed a young woman approaching his row carrying a stack of medical textbooks and wearing the kind of determined expression that he'd learned to recognize in people who were pursuing dreams that required them to outwork everyone around them just to get a fair chance at success. She moved with the particular energy of someone who'd been inspired by a story and was working to create their own version of it. "Excuse me," she said politely, stopping beside his seat with a respectful smile. "I'm Dr. Sarah Chen, and I just wanted to thank you for the scholarship program you created with Dr. Williams. I'm one of the recipients, and I'm starting my residency in pediatric oncology next month because of the support your foundation provided." The conversation that followed was brief but significant, a reminder that individual acts of justice and kindness have the power to ripple outward in ways that extend far beyond their original impact. Dr. Chen shared her story of growing up as the daughter of immigrants, working multiple jobs to pay for medical school, and almost giving up her dream of becoming a doctor, because the financial pressures seemed insurmountable until the scholarship had provided the support she needed to continue. "The thing that inspired me most wasn't just the money," Dr. Chen said as she prepared to continue to her own seat. "It was learning that someone had looked at a difficult situation and chosen to respond by creating opportunities for other people instead of just seeking revenge. That's the kind of doctor I want to be. Someone who sees problems and works to solve them, not just for myself, but for everyone who comes after me." As the aircraft pushed back from the gate and began its taxi toward the runway, Damon reflected on the year that had passed and the lessons that had emerged from what had started as a simple seating dispute, but had evolved into something much more significant. Victoria Ashworth's attempt to use her presumed privilege to displace someone she considered beneath her social station had ended her career and her freedom. But more importantly, it had created opportunities for people like Aisha Williams and Sarah Chen to build careers and make contributions that would benefit countless others. The plane lifted into the clear Geneva sky, climbing steadily above the Alps toward the Atlantic crossing that would take them home. Through the small window beside his seat, Damon could see the mountains falling away below them, their snow-covered peaks catching the late afternoon sunlight in ways that reminded him why he'd fallen in love with flying in the first place. There was something profound about the perspective that came from rising above the surface complications of daily life and seeing the larger patterns that connected everything together. Every seat on the aircraft had been earned through someone's work dreams and determination. Every passenger carried their own story of challenges overcome and goals pursued. And every flight represented a small democracy where people from completely different backgrounds shared the same destination and the same faith that they would arrive safely through the skill and dedication of people they would never meet, but whose competence their lives depended upon. The captain's voice came over the intercom to announce their cruising altitude and expected arrival time, the routine information that marked the transition from departure to journey. Outside the window, the sky was clear and limitless, full of possibilities that extended beyond the horizon. And in seat 2, a Damon Hayes opened his book and began to read, carrying forward the quiet dignity and purposeful leadership that had transformed a moment of conflict into a legacy of opportunity that would continue long after the current flight had reached its destination. Justice, he had learned, doesn't always come with dramatic gestures or immediate consequences. Sometimes it arrives quietly through changed policies and expanded opportunities through people who are inspired to lift others up rather than tear them down, through the simple recognition that every person deserves to be treated with dignity regardless of their background, appearance, or apparent circumstances. And sometimes it comes at 35,000 feet, one flight at a time. Victoria Ashworth served her full sentence in federal prison and now works at a call center in Queens, her social media presence reduced to a private account with fewer than 50 followers. Bradford never practiced law again and works in insurance adjusting. Their family's corruption network was dismantled completely, with 17 other individuals facing federal charges for related crimes. Dr. Aisha Williams became the youngest department head in her hospital's history and speaks regularly about representation in medicine. The scholarship program she inspired has assisted over 300 students and is expanding internationally. She keeps a photo from that Geneva flight on her desk as a reminder that change often begins with someone choosing to see potential where others see problems. Damon Hayes continues flying commercial whenever possible, maintaining his connection to customer experience while building Apex Airways into the industry leader in passenger equity. The company's training programs are now required study at 3 business schools. Sometimes the most powerful victories are measured not in punishments delivered but in opportunities created for people who simply needed someone to recognize they belonged exactly where they were.